Basra, Iraq, May 2003. A British Challenger 2 has lost a track in a narrow street and cannot move. The crew cannot abandon the vehicle to exit on foot in this part of Basra. At this moment is to die. Over the next hour, insurgents fire rocket-propelled grenades at the stationary tank. They fire again and again. By the time a recovery vehicle reaches the Challenger 2 and pulls it clear, the hull has absorbed 70 direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades. 70. The crew is alive. The tank is damaged, but not destroyed. Its Chobham armour, a classified composite of ceramics, steel, and materials the British government still will not fully describe, has absorbed a punishment that would have killed the crew of any other vehicle on Earth. The recovery team counts the impact marks. They stop counting at 70. 2 years later, in a separate incident in Basra, another Challenger 2 is hit by 14 RPG rounds and a Milan anti-tank missile, a weapon system that was destroying Soviet tanks in the Yom Kippur War and still does not burn. The crew survives. In 22 years of British Army service across Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq, not a single Challenger 2 was destroyed by enemy fire. Not one. It was the most survivable tank in the world, and it had the record to prove it. Then Britain sent 14 of them to Ukraine, and everything changed. To understand what the Challenger 2 was, you need to understand what Britain was trying to build in the 1980s and why it took the approach it did. The Challenger 1 that preceded it had been a capable vehicle, but had earned a reputation for mechanical unreliability that followed it through the 1991 Gulf War, despite an impressive kill record. Vickers Defense Systems began design work on the Challenger 2 in 1986 with a single overriding priority. Whatever else the new tank was, it would be reliable, and it would keep its crew alive. The Chobham armour system, developed at the British Army's research establishment at Chobham in Surrey in the early 1970s, was the centerpiece. The exact composition of the Dorchester Level 2 armor fitted to the Challenger 2 remains classified to this day. What is publicly known is that it combines ceramic tiles, composite materials, and steel in a layered arrangement that defeats both kinetic energy penetrators and shaped charge warheads through different mechanisms. The ceramics shatter incoming penetrators. The composite layers absorb and disperse the energy. In Iraq, a T-72 at 5 kilometers was the longest confirmed tank-to-tank kill in history. A Challenger 2 put a round through it at a range that no other tank gun in the world had achieved in combat. In Basra, those 70 RPG hits were absorbed by armor that had been designed to stop weapons considerably more capable than rocket-propelled grenades, and it held. The Challenger 2 was not just surviving these engagements, it was making the concept of attacking it seem futile. The gun was part of the story. The L-30A1 120mm rifled barrel was unique among NATO main battle tanks, which had universally adopted smoothbore guns by the 1980s. Britain kept the rifled barrel because rifling imparted greater accuracy at long range, the same reason rifles replaced muskets. The trade-off was that the Challenger 2 could not fire the standard NATO 120mm smoothbore ammunition used by every other Western tank. It required its own ammunition, produced only in Britain, which meant any sustained operation required a dedicated British logistics chain for main gun rounds. In Iraq, this was manageable. British tanks operated alongside British supply lines. In Ukraine, where 14 Challenger 2s were handed to Ukrainian crews who spoke no English and were operating alongside tanks from a dozen different NATO nations, this became a serious problem that would compound over time. The British decision to send Challenger 2s to Ukraine in January 2023 was driven by a logic that was politically sound but operationally complicated. 14 tanks, 1 squadron, Ukrainian crews trained in Britain for several weeks before returning home with vehicles they barely knew. Ukrainian soldiers spoke positively about the Challenger 2's optics and fire control systems. Crews claimed engagement at more than 5 kilometers, an extraordinary range for tank combat, but raised consistent concerns about the tank's maintenance complexity, its non-standard ammunition supply chain, and the reality of operating a vehicle designed for British Army doctrine in a war being fought at Ukrainian operational tempo. The Challenger 2 had been designed to be crewed by soldiers who trained on it for months or years. Ukraine had weeks. September 4, 2023. The record ended. A Ukrainian Challenger 2 was destroyed in combat for the first time. A Russian Kornet anti-tank missile, a laser-guided weapon capable of penetrating 1,200 millimeters of rolled steel, struck the vehicle. The crew survived. The hull did not. For many observers, the survival of the crew, even after the vehicle's destruction, was the story. British design had prioritized crew survivability to the point that even losing the tank kept the men alive. But the destruction of the vehicle itself, the first Challenger 2 ever killed by an enemy, ended 2 decades of a record that had made the vehicle's reputation. By early 2025, at least 4 of the 14 had been destroyed. During the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk in 2024, 3 more were visually confirmed destroyed. The small number sent to Ukraine meant that even limited losses had a disproportionate impact, and keeping the surviving fleet operational had become increasingly difficult, as spare parts, specialized, British-sourced, not interchangeable with anything else Ukraine operated, became harder to source. The Challenger 3 upgrade program told a different story about where the vehicle's weaknesses actually lay. The Challenger 2 that had survived 70 RPG hits in Basra had done so with a second-generation thermal imaging system that was already obsolescent. It had no hunter-killer capability, the ability to designate one target while the gunner engaged another. Its fire control computer was dated. Its digital architecture was the same one designed in the late 1980s. The armor had been extraordinary, the electronics had aged. The Challenger 3 program, which fitted a new turret with a Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore gun, finally adopting NATO standard ammunition, a trophy active protection system, and a completely modernized fire control and commander sight system, addressed every one of these gaps. The first Challenger 3 was delivered to the British Army in 2023. The remaining fleet of 148 Challenger 2s will eventually be upgraded to Challenger 3 standard. The new variant can finally fire standard NATO ammunition, finally has a trophy system to intercept incoming missiles, and finally has the electronic architecture that the 21st century battlefield demands. The Challenger 2's legacy in Ukraine is complicated by the numbers. 14 tanks is not a meaningful armored force, it is a gesture. The German Leopard 2 was sent in much larger quantities, dozens, eventually over 100, from multiple contributing nations, and suffered losses proportional to a vehicle that was actually being used at scale. The American Abrams was sent and had to be withdrawn from the front line when drone surveillance made it clear that the Russian forces were prioritizing Abrams kills for propaganda value. The Challenger 2 was never numerous enough to be decisive and was always present enough to be a target. The crews who fought in them found the protection and optics impressive and the logistics impossible. One crew reportedly engaged a Russian target at 5 kilometers and killed it, an achievement that no other tank in Ukraine had matched at that range. Another was lost to a Kornet missile. Both outcomes were consistent with the vehicle's actual capabilities and actual limitations simultaneously. The Challenger 2 was not, as its reputation suggested, invincible. No tank is invincible, and the Basra incidents that built the legend involved stationary vehicles absorbing relatively primitive weapons in conditions very different from the open terrain, drone-saturated, ATGM-heavy environment of eastern Ukraine. What it had always been, was the tank that prioritized keeping its crew alive above all other considerations. In Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Iraq, and in Ukraine, the crews of Challenger 2s came home alive from engagements that destroyed their vehicles. That record, not the number of vehicles lost, but the number of crews who walked away, is the real story of the tank that Britain built. 70 RPG hits in Basra, 14 Milan and RPG hits in a second incident, a Kornet in Ukraine. In every case, the crew survived. The Challenger 2 was not the tank that could not be destroyed. It was the tank that could not be made to kill its crew. In the mathematics of modern armored warfare, those are not the same thing, but the second is, arguably, the more important achievement. The production numbers tell their own story. 447 Challenger 2s were built between 1993 and 2002 for the British Army, plus 38 for Oman. Production ended in 2002 and has never resumed. The tooling no longer exists to build new ones. The factories where they were made, at Newcastle upon Tyne and Leeds, have been repurposed. Britain has a fixed inventory of Challenger 2s and no way to increase it. When 14 were sent to Ukraine, 14 were subtracted from the British Army's total. When replacements were sought, there were no replacements. There was only the upgrade program, turning existing Challenger 2s into Challenger 3s at a cost of approximately £8 million per vehicle, and the slow attrition of a finite fleet that could not be replenished. The decision to send 14 to Ukraine was made knowing this. The strategic calculation was that 14 British tanks would have more symbolic and political value to the alliance than their loss would have operational cost to the British Army. Whether that calculation was correct will be debated for years. What is not debatable is what the Challenger 2 actually was as an engineering achievement. A tank that absorbed 70 RPG hits and kept its crew alive. A tank that killed an enemy vehicle at 5 kilometers, a range no other tank gun had achieved in combat. A tank whose armor composition remains classified more than 50 years after the Chobham system was developed because it is still considered sensitive enough to protect. A tank that, in 2 decades of combat operations, never allowed an enemy weapon to kill its crew. The cornet in September 2023 that destroyed the hull in Ukraine and left the crew alive was not a failure of the Challenger 2. It was the Challenger 2 succeeding at the thing it had always been designed to do first. The vehicle died. The people inside it did not. In the history of tank design, that has always been the hardest thing to achieve. The British managed it. They managed it for 20 years without an exception. And when the exception came, in Ukraine, against a weapon that can penetrate 1,200 millimeters of steel, the crew still came home.